Welcome back, Time Crunch fans. I'm your host, Coach Adam Pulford, here today to answer your questions submitted by you, our audience. We have some great topics, including Zwift racing, aerobic cross training, and pushing beyond boundaries. In the spirit of time crunchedness, let's dive right in. So, question number one is all about Zwift racing and how to incorporate it into training. So, here is the actual original question. Hi, Adam. Thanks for taking the question. I'm a big fan of the podcast and appreciate how thoroughly you answer listener questions. Thank you. No, I try my best at that. I'm a 38-year-old father. By the way, this is coming from Chris. So here's his little intro and then the question. I'm a 38-year-old father and have three young kids and can typically squeeze in only about 4 to 5 hours of training per week. I aim for 4 45-minute weekend rides, half zone 2 and half threshold or VO2 intervals, with a 2-hour endurance ride on the weekend. I recently discovered Zwift racing and it's helped me to have fun and stay motivated, but I'm not sure how to adjust my training with it. I'll typically do 2 races a week, a shorter 30 to 40 minute weekday race, and then a longer 60 to 90 minute weekend one. I also got promoted to a higher CAT 3.2 to 4 watts per kilo, and my 3.4 watt per kilo is dropped after one lap. So here's the question. Should I take extra rest after these races or just treat them like a normal VO2 or anaerobic interval day? Thanks for your thoughts. Again, Chris. All right, Chris. So first of all, congrats to you on catting up on Zwift. That's hard to do, and if you're pushing those watts per kilo, you're a fit dude. So nice work on that. Incorporating Zwift racing into a training program should be think about it as any other hard day, in my opinion. And here's how I think best to do it. Number one, have somewhat of a bigger picture in mind with it. Number two, go into each race fresh. Number three, have periods where you don't race for a bit. Okay, so let's take those three aspects of having a bigger picture, going into the race fresh, and then having periods where you don't race for a while. Let's break each of those down. So the first one is having a bigger picture. What I mean by this is never lose sight of your overall goals and development, especially in the way of developing your energy systems. Your kind of like sprinty one, your going hard one, which we call like kind of VO2 and threshold, and then also your aerobic development. You have strengths and weaknesses that lie within those sort of like power durations or those three energy systems. And you want to make sure that you keep developing those as you're going. And Zwift racing can play a role into that. Racing hard every week is not the best method to get there. So if you just started and you're having fun, I would say like enjoy it for sure. Now, if you have somewhat of a periodized program and you have some longer term goals here, that's going to help you stay organized by sticking to that periodized program. Now, it could be as simple as just weaving in the races when it matches the goal of the periodized plan, in particular, threshold, basically. Like every Zwift race is essentially a threshold effort. And it's a hard threshold effort, too. It's not like steady state extensive threshold or like extensive threshold development, which I've talked about on the podcast before. It's intensive threshold development. And it also goes kind of long. So it's like, it is a hard day for sure. Now, when I say treat Zwift racing like a hard day in the training program, you can kind of deduce some of the other advice I have on the podcast where any hard day, I want you to go into it fresh, because if you go into it fresh, you'll be able to give your best effort, which then you'll get the best training effect. And if you rest, you'll get the best adaptation. And that's what I would encourage you to do, Chris. Now, generally, like I talked about on this is a hard threshold day. If you're a time crunched athlete, like you're crunched on time for both training and recovery. So it's best to have almost like a polarized sort of rhythm going on where it could be something like this, for an example. Monday's rest, Tuesday, Zwift race, hard. Wednesday, endurance, zone 2. Thursday, 3 by 10 threshold intervals. Friday, rest. Saturday, your 2-hour endurance ride. And then Sunday, rest. Quick caveat there. Some people are like, oh, Sunday rest and Monday rest? 2 days of rest in a row? Yeah, totally. If you only have, 4 to 5 hours of training, you can only ride 4 days a week. That's how to do it. And that way you're coming into the Zwift race as fresh as possible. You have as much energy and kind of like stored energy on your body and energy in your mind to handle that Zwift race. That's how I would do it, especially in a threshold block where we're going for FTP or intensive FTP training. Now, my third point was to have periods where you're not racing on Zwift 2. Okay. The reason why this is important is just get away from it for once in a while. Okay. Like maybe a month or a few weeks so that you can focus on your individual needs as an athlete. That could be simply zone 2 base training, right? We've talked about that on the podcast before, where we're doing things from a physiological sense where high intensity training is not as advantageous as low intensity training. Also, if we have been racing and you're kind of like building up, and all of a sudden for a lot of North American athletes, summertime hits and you want to go do the group rides, you've got some other events outside and you're not riding inside as much, yeah, get away from Zwift racing. No need to do it, in my opinion. Now back to the intensity part of Zwift racing. It's a high aerobic, mostly threshold, and yes, you can gas yourself, get dropped like you said, Chris, and it's a hard day. But really, when we're doing it, 30, 40, 60, even 90 minutes, that's primarily the glycolytic energy system that you're using. It's not pure VO2 work. Certainly isn't zone 2 endurance work. So again, it's a hard day, and that's where I would lump it in again with either like a threshold, sweet spot, intensive threshold development. It kind of works in a lot of periods in your training. So if you're always doing Zwift races, you can see how you're just like pressing on the gas pedal too much throughout the week. I've said on the podcast several times where I think 2 to 3 days most for most time crunched athletes is the best to have high intensity like this. So the other stuff should be zone 2. And when we're talking about getting away from racing so you can focus on the individual stuff, whether that is your zone 2 or aerobic training, there's also a time period for the anaerobic capacity training. So that's zone 5 and higher. And if you're incorporating Zwift racing into a time period where you want to be focused on anaerobic capacity, I think that the Zwift racing will just be too hard and you won't be as fresh going into the anaerobic efforts. So therefore, I would probably not race too much when you're doing that, unless you're super dialed on sleep and you space out the anaerobic capacity work with the Zwift racing. So if we go back to like kind of that backbone example I had above, where Monday was rest or Sunday was rest, Monday was rest. Tuesday, we hit anaerobic capacity intervals. Then we have zone 2 training on Wednesday, and perhaps Thursdays, zone 2, Fridays off. Then you want to do a Zwift race on Saturday because that is motivating and helps you like rack up the volume, or it helps for the 2 hours to go past. I'd say that still checks out fairly well because an anaerobic capacity sort of training block, I mean, it is high intensity. You want contrast between those training periods and that much time or that many days in between the anaerobic capacity intervals. And then the Zwift racing, that's completely appropriate so long as you're recovering well in between. So that's my advice there. Then have periods where you're really focused on racing. And this is what I do with some of my athletes that enjoy Zwift racing, is they probably are racing throughout the year. But then fall, winter hits and we're not really ready to take a break because for like my master's level riders, my time crunched athletes, I try to keep them going 50 weeks a year, basically, which is very consistent. And so if you're into Zwift racing, this is a great time period where you could do 3 races per week. And again, just come in fresh, keep contrast between. So maybe like every other day in your example, Chris, with what you have available to work with, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, you could be hitting those shorter group rides or races on Zwift on Tuesday, same thing on Thursday, and then the harder, longer one, or even a short one on Saturday. zone 2 or recovery in between, and there you have it. So, in summary, to you, Chris, and also to all those listening, treat Zwift like a hard day. Go into it fresh, take an easier day afterwards, and that will help bring contrast to your training, meaning you're keeping your hard days hard, your easy days easy. Cycle these as workouts in the grand scheme of periodization, meaning build yourself up aerobically so that you can handle it. Use Zwift racing as hard intensity when it's appropriate in your progressive build. Then get away from it once in a while so you can incorporate other individual aspects of your training that isn't pertaining to racing. And after all, I'll remind you this: variety is also a principle of training, meaning your body needs training, a different training stimulus in order to keep improving and break beyond plateaus. So don't forget to just change it up. All right, so now time for question number 2. This pertains to cross training, so let's get into it here. The topic is best cross training alternatives to building a solid base of zone 2 training when you live in a mountainous terrain. This is coming from Rick. It's kind of a long one, but he frames it up well. So let's see what Rick has to say here. Personally, I find early season riding challenging to keep intensity from escalating simply due to the frequency of hills and gradients of the climbs where I live in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Northern Virginia. Beautiful spot to ride. If anyone has not ridden there and you're looking for a place, go see Rick in the Blue Ridge Mountains. It's beautiful. Now, to ensure that I can build the base at the right intensity, I indoor row using a Concept 2 row machine, 60 minutes, 2 to 3 times a week, keeping the intensity in zone 2. Do you have experience with riders using indoor rowing to supplement their base build? Is the increased muscle mass used in rowing over cycling enough to make 60-minute sessions effective at base development? I prefer rowing over indoor bike training. Other days I ride outside whenever possible to let the terrain create unstructured interval work that often translates to zone 3-4 efforts over the hills and the valleys and roads for recovery. Any other feedback you have on indoor rowing training as a supplement to cycling, I would enjoy hearing. I'm 54 years old, lifelong cyclist who picked up indoor rowing when my family and career absorbed most of my time in training life. Now I find consistent rowing keeps my bike fitness higher. Beyond cross training with rowing, I do strength training 2 times a week. I enjoy your podcasts. And again, that's coming from Rick. Rick, it's so a great summary of everything. And you know what? Yes, rowing is great. And yes, I use it with my athletes who have a row machine or a desire to do it. And I think it's an awesome training tool to use, especially the way that you're doing it. Okay. So I even use rowing as interval training or as like a warm up portion to strength training. So maybe let me give you some specific examples here. Okay. So to your inquiry, what I like about what you've written in here with Rick is you found another modality of aerobic training to keep you consistent throughout the year versus just riding a bike. And like I said in the first question, where I try to keep my time-crunched athletes really consistent throughout the year. And some of that is adding in different variety and stuff that really motivates you to get it done. And as long as we're sticking to the program of if it's zone 2 training and just getting aerobic conditioning in, rowing is a fantastic way to do that. And this may be more healthy in the long term than you realize, as it incorporates different muscle groups, different movement patterns, and adds variety with seasonality into your training program. So for anyone listening who has like tried rowing before or has never tried rowing before, I wouldn't dive in with just 60 minutes straight of rowing. Okay. It's pretty hard to do, in other words. So I would start a little bit smaller here. And so I probably don't need to go over this with you, Rick, you found something that has worked for you. So for listeners who have never tried rowing before, or maybe you have, right? And you couldn't even do it 10 minutes continuously. my advice is to start small and progressively overload if you wish to use rowing as a training tool. So here's some examples. In the base time period, and this is for a beginner, I would warm up with simply 5 minutes easy at an RPE of 2 to 3. Take it easy for a minute and then use aerobic intervals. We're just like creating little mini intervals here with 4 minutes at a rate of perceived effort of 4 to 5 out of 10. And then you take 1 minute resting where you do nothing. Okay. It's short. It's only 1 minute, but we want to keep that heart rate high, keep you're not fully recovering because it is just aerobic, and repeat that 3 times, 4 times. Okay. Progressively build up. And for the first session, maybe it's only 15 minutes long. Maybe it's 20 minutes. Build up so that you're getting through that and the rate of perceived efforts are staying fairly low for 30 minutes of a total workout time. Now, for a novice, maybe warm up with 10 minutes of easy rowing. Perceived effort there again is only 3 to 4. And then what you can do is make these same like aerobic intervals, just make them longer. So we're extensive aerobic development here in the way of thinking about this, where maybe it's 8, 9, 10 minutes of interval time. The rate of perceived effort is 4 to 6. And then you're using 1 to 2 minute easy rowing or resting. Then you repeat it. Build up to that 40 to 60 minutes of total workout time, like Rick has done here, because that's kind of like time segment for a time crunched athlete works really well. And if you break it up like that with rowing, that can help wrap your brain around it and change up the muscle groups, especially if you're new to it. Now, an advanced athlete, what I would do is have a 10 minute or so, 10 to 15 minute easy rowing, perceived effort 4 to 5, and then I would just go 45 minutes straight. And with an advanced rower, we can start to focus on the kind of like the stroke or the row, how powerful they are. These Concept 2 row machines do have power outputs, and they're tracking distance and all that kind of stuff. So we use that as more or less like a power meter or a cycling computer, and without getting too in depth with it, all I do with my athletes is the same principles and intervals and intensive versus extensive sort of concepts. I apply that to rowing. And so, Rick, to you specifically, and for advanced rowers, what you can do is you can essentially, if you're in your base build and you're just kind of like training to train, you're just trying to get fit, you can do threshold work on the indoor row machine and then just ride your bike outside. So something like 3 by 8 minutes at RPE of 7 or 8 out of 10, then take a 3 minute recovery period with a warm up and cool down. That's a great workout on the row machine. It's hard for sure, but yeah, you could start to incorporate some of those structured interval workouts on the row machine if that sounds fun to you. Now, the other thing I like that you're doing here, Rick, is you're incorporating, quote, natural intervals into your routine, and you're doing it, how should I say this? Not all the time. I do this in my own. What I mean by that is you're going outside and just riding some hills, and you're letting the topography elicit the intensity. And I do this in my own training. I call it lazy coach training. Essentially, I don't want to follow a structured program for the day. So I make my goal to, okay, I'm going to work on threshold hill climb today. So I just head out to the hills, going easy, warm up, and I aim for zone 4. That's my goal for each hill climb. And I hit threshold or zone 4 on the hill climb. I use the downhill as my recovery. I pedal endurance over the next hill. Then I hit zone 4 again on the next hill. I do that until I'm tired, and then I head home. So super simple. And if there's any audience listening here who has never done that before, I suggest trying it. It gets your brain out of interval mode, meaning, it's not overly structured, and there's benefits there. Okay. And the reason that there's benefits there is because I've had athletes who, if I try to change it up like this, and say they've been doing way too much interval work, you get really used to having a break or having a break that is there in front of you. So like mentally, the stress of not having super structured work can be taxing. So this is a way to unwind your brain from that. Now, secondly, if the goal is to go in zone 4 until you can't, or you're until you run out of time. That could be confusing and I would say stressful to a lot of people as well. But I suggest doing it because you might be able to push through some boundaries that you may never thought possible. For example, if you're used to 3x10s all the time or 3x15s, and that's like the biggest stretch you've ever done, and you've got some long hill climbs, or you're used to, let's just say, 30 to 60 minutes of time in zone, but you have a couple hours and you go out and you hit zone 4 and you're hitting it, and all of a sudden you got 75 minutes of time in zone. Now you've just pushed beyond a boundary, like a time zone where you've never been before. For some people listening, it's like, man, 3x8s are hard. But if you go out and you push beyond what you've done before, you've stressed the body more. And now you start to have more of a capacity and a realization of what you can do. So for me, when I'm doing this with my athletes, I think it really tunes them into their bodies more. It helps with pacing, it helps with perceived effort, and it also tunes you into when are you tired. So with my athletes, I will tell them on certain days, I call it self-determined training. If we're doing some threshold work and they're feeling good and we've got 40 minutes of threshold prescribed for today, if they're feeling good, go up to 60. And that's where I'm giving the autonomy to the athlete to go for it if they are feeling good. Not harder, but add more. And this is this kind of like unstructured way of doing it that Rick is talking about, and I kind of took liberties on how I do it. That's a pretty cool way of exploring with it without using intervals and without being overly structured. So finally, Rick, I think you're doing all the right things because you're periodizing your training a bit, meaning you're cycling intensities with seasonality. You're using a variety of exercise modalities, cycling and rowing, and you're using different terrain to change things up. And you're doing strength training 2 times a week. You're the model of what every time-crunched cyclist athlete should be, in my opinion, with everything that you wrote in about, I guess. And I guess as I think about it, the last thing is the upper body muscles or the musculature that you may build in rowing. Does it apply to cycling? Is there carryover there? I wouldn't worry too much about it because that specific musculature that you build up, you're not going to like develop a huge upper body to where it's going to take away or hurt from cycling because everything that you're doing is aerobic in nature. So sure, you might carry a pound or two or have a little bit more lean body mass in the upper body, but that's actually super healthy the older we get. Preserving or increasing lean body mass the older we get, it's hard to do, and you should maintain that as much as possible. So my opinion, Rick, keep it going, keep being a rock star, and right back in with how it's going. We'd love to hear how your very unstructured periodized plan is going. So in closing, I want to thank you all once again for not just listening to the podcast, but sharing your questions, your challenges, and curiosities by writing into us here at CTS. So if you're new to the show, how to do this is by heading over to trainright.com/podcast and click on Ask a Training Question. Your questions get sent directly to me, and we do our best to answer it on upcoming episodes. That's it. That's our show for today. If you liked what you heard, please share it with a training partner or a friend, as that's the best way to grow the show and make sure that you keep getting actionable training advice for your athletic journey. Be sure to come back next week for more. And until then, keep getting out there and keep training right.